He only wanted a sandwich. That's what he told himself as he walked into the franchise he'd built from nothing. But as he stood in line, the two teenage boys behind him started talking. Not knowing who he was, not caring who might hear. And what they said stopped him cold. Mocking a man who came in begging for work. Laughing at throwing away food, just for fun. In that moment, everything he thought he knew about his company collapsed. Who was really to blame, them or him? And what would you do if you heard your legacy cracking behind your back? It was a sleepy Tuesday afternoon when an unassuming man in a plain navy hoodie stepped into a storefront with frosted windows and the glow of overhead LED menus. The location, one of hundreds under the brand Grillcraft, didn't look much different from the others. Modern, minimal, just corporate enough to feel clean but personal enough to feel familiar. He moved slowly, as if testing the tiles beneath his shoes, absorbing the sterile scent of grilled chicken, fryer oil, and faintly stale mop water. A few customers sat alone at scattered tables, noses in their phones, waiting for food. No one gave the man a second glance. That was just how he wanted it. He was George Whitaker, billionaire, founder and CEO of Grillcraft Incorporated. But today he was G. No entourage, no private driver, no clipboard. Just an old man in jeans and sneakers looking to grab a bite. Or at least that was the cover. He kept his head low as he joined the short line, eyes drifting toward the counter. Behind the glass sneeze guard, two teenage boys moved lazily, joking as they tossed fries into baskets and smeared sauces on burgers. They looked no older than 16, maybe 17, one with a curly mullet and a voice too loud for the space. The other slouched with his cap on backwards, poking at the register with one hand while scrolling on his phone with the other. "Bro, did you see that homeless guy yesterday?" The loud one laughed, glancing around but not noticing George. "Came in looking for a job. Looked like he hadn't showered since Bush was president." The other boy chuckled, tossing a chicken tender into his mouth. "Yeah, and Marco told him we're not hiring unless you got teeth and deodorant." I almost died. Bro dude left with tears in his eyes. George didn't move. Not a muscle. The laughter echoed off the walls like nails scratching vinyl. He stared ahead, but he wasn't looking at the menu anymore. His mind was a thunderstorm. That homeless man could have been anyone. Could have been him 30 years ago when he was living in a friend's garage, eating dollar ramen while working triple shifts. He clenched his jaw as another line of mockery danced into the air. "And that old lady who couldn't count change yesterday?" the slouched one added. "She gave me $20 instead of 10. I didn't say nothing. Free lunch, baby." George's stomach churned. He took a slow breath, suppressing the instinct to reveal himself, to scream, to fire someone on the spot. But he couldn't, not yet. This was why he was here. Not for secret shopping. Not for press ops. For truth. The company had grown too fast. Investors were happy, quarterly reports gleamed. But something had been gnawing at him. Complaints buried under middle management, a decline in customer loyalty, whispers of culture rot. So he decided to go deep. Not with corporate surveys or feedback forms. With his own eyes. As the boys continued their cruel gossip, George stepped aside from the line and sat down in the farthest booth, back to the wall. From here, he could observe everything. The way customers were barely greeted. The way the mop bucket was left in the middle of the hallway. How a mother had to repeat herself twice just to get ketchup. It wasn't chaos. It was something worse, apathy. It wasn't just these two boys. The manager was in the back room, glancing at a laptop while a timer beeped unanswered on the fryer. No one cared. No one had pride. And yet, it had all once started with love. Love of service. Love of food. Love of people. George lowered his eyes to the table, trying not to think about how far this place had strayed. He thought about his wife. How she used to sneak into the kitchen to teach staff how to season potatoes with intention. How she'd told him, "When you stop caring about the little things, the big things crumble." He didn't even know when it happened. Maybe the moment they went public. Maybe the moment she passed away. Or maybe it had happened slowly, like a leak behind the walls, spreading mold until the whole house started to stink and no one knew why. The laughter kept going, oblivious to the man in the booth whose name was on the founding charter. George stood abruptly, walked out without ordering, and got into his rental car, fists white on the steering wheel. This wasn't just a bad location. It was a wake-up call. Before there was an empire, there was grease on his apron and calluses on his fingers. George Whitaker had started the same way most people assumed he didn't. Broke, alone, and tired. He was 23, fresh out of the foster system, and washing dishes in a greasy spoon diner off Route 87, where the tile floors stuck to your boots and the grill hissed louder than the jukebox. He didn't have a degree, connections, or even a reliable place to sleep. What he had was grit, a knack for flavors, and a quiet hunger to belong somewhere. When the cook quit mid-shift one night after a screaming match with the owner, George stepped up. He'd watched long enough. Burgers, fries, melts, chili. He made them all with precision, seasoning by instinct, plating like it mattered. That night, customers stayed late, complimented the food, tipped more than usual. The owner didn't say thank you, but George got promoted the next morning anyway. For the next decade, he worked his way through kitchens across the state, saving every dollar he didn't spend on rent or instant noodles. He never took vacations, never got sick. He read about restaurant trends late into the night, studied spreadsheets even when he barely knew what the cells meant. But the most important moment came not in a kitchen, but in a booth when he met June. She was a customer, sitting alone, scribbling poetry on a napkin while waiting for a takeout order. He brought her an extra milkshake on the house. She smiled like no one ever had. They talked for hours. 3 years later, they were married. She believed in him long before the world did. When George talked about owning a place that treated staff like family, where no one went unseen and food wasn't just product but purpose, June didn't just listen. She built it with him. She handled the designs, the training culture, the community events. Their dream wasn't to be rich. It was to be proud. Grillcraft opened its first location in a converted car garage in 2004. It had 4 tables, no air conditioning, and a hand-drawn chalkboard menu. But customers kept coming. George cooked every meal himself while June ran the floor like a symphony. They gave away meals to veterans. They posted handwritten notes from kids who said the fries were the best in the universe. Word spread. Articles were written. Within 2 years, they had 5 locations, then 15. They started hiring from shelters, offering free GED prep for employees, and built a second-chance hiring pipeline for the formerly incarcerated. Their mission wasn't marketing, it was marrow deep. When investors finally came knocking, George hesitated. Expansion could mean dilution. Scale could mean sacrifice. But June reminded him that more locations meant more lives changed. So they took the leap. The company exploded. By 2015, Grillcraft had 200 stores across the country. June's training videos were required for every new hire. Their slogan, "More than a meal, a moment," was printed on every receipt. They got featured on national news. They met with governors. Celebrities tweeted about them. But with growth came distance. District managers replaced franchise owners. Spreadsheets replaced handshakes. Complaints became numbers, not names. When June got sick in 2018, George stepped back from daily operations to care for her. It was the beginning of the drift. She passed away on a cold morning in November, with George by her side, holding her hand and whispering the recipe for her favorite garlic aioli, just to make her smile. After her funeral, he tried to return to work, but everything felt different. Board meetings felt colder. Franchisees more impatient. Some wanted to cut costs, automate more, reduce the training budget. George resisted, until one particular meeting when a young executive called the original mission outdated idealism. He didn't fight that day. He just went quiet. But something inside him fractured. Years passed. The company kept growing. New stores opened. Revenue stayed high. But customers who once swore by Grillcraft began to drift to newer concepts. Review scores dropped. Turnover spiked. Then came the scandals, isolated incidents at first. An employee throwing food at a homeless man. Another caught mocking a disabled customer on TikTok. George wanted answers. He demanded accountability. But by then, he was surrounded by people who managed from reports, not from the floor. They showed him sanitized versions of reality. He felt like a stranger in the company he created. And that's when he decided to go back undercover. No cameras, no production crew, just him and his hoodie. He wanted to see the truth, unfiltered. He wanted to walk into a location as if he were anyone, as if he were June, or the man she once gave a free meal to in the rain. He didn't want to punish anyone. He wanted to understand. But when he heard those two boys joking about crushing dreams and pocketing change, when he saw a manager sitting idly while apathy bloomed like mold in every corner, he realized something devastating. He hadn't just stepped away from the business to grieve. He'd left a void, and the void had been filled by something monstrous. That moment wasn't about two boys. It was about a rot that had spread across the foundation. George remembered what June used to say, "A legacy isn't what you build. It's what they carry on without you." He had assumed her spirit lived in the company still. But maybe he had been wrong. Maybe it was time to stop assuming and start rebuilding, not with memos but with action, with presence, with truth, even if it meant burning part of it down first. George returned the next day, this time at peak lunch hour. The line was longer, the noise thicker, and the pace slightly more frantic, but the core remained the same. The same boys were behind the counter, only now with their volume turned up, their bravado more emboldened by the presence of a crowd. He watched them toss sauces carelessly, bark at customers to read the screen, and roll their eyes when an elderly man asked how to redeem a coupon. The man's hands trembled slightly as he fumbled with his phone, his voice so quiet it barely registered. One of the boys smirked and loudly mimicked him after he left, voice cracking in exaggerated mockery as they laughed and high-fived. The manager, a woman in her 30s with a Bluetooth earpiece and her hair in a messy bun, was seated near the window sipping a fountain drink, scrolling through something on her tablet, pretending not to see. George had seen enough. He stayed for hours. He ordered something small just to avoid suspicion, then sat in the corner nursing his tray like a ghost in his own house. He watched the operation from every angle. The front register, the dining area, the pickup counter, the way orders were passed along with as little eye contact as possible. He noticed the way the cash drawer didn't close fully between transactions, how one of the boys always seemed to have a wad of bills on him even after clocking out. He noticed the girl on fries flinching when one of them shouted too loud. And he noticed something far more unsettling. No one smiled. Not the staff, not the customers. There was a suffocating chill in the air, a joylessness that clung to the walls like mildew. The brand that once prided itself on warmth had gone cold. But the worst came when he went to throw out his tray. Near the kitchen hallway, behind the stainless steel door that led to the back room, he heard a muffled argument. A man's voice, gruff and cruel. "You think just 'cause you got a limp you get out of carrying boxes? Either you pull your weight or you're gone. I don't give a damn about your doctor's note." A low voice responded, nervous, apologetic. "I'm sorry, I dropped it yesterday, and it hasn't." The other voice cut him off with a scoff and footsteps storming away. Moments later, a man emerged, wearing a black polo with the words, "District Leader," embroidered on the chest. He didn't notice George. He didn't even glance at the customers. He just adjusted his watch and strutted out the front like he owned the place. George slipped quietly through the door he'd come from, pretending to head to the bathroom but instead stepping into the back hall. There, in the corner of the storage area, sat a man in his 50s, rubbing his knee with shaking hands. George recognized the type. Former line cook, maybe once a kitchen manager. Someone who'd probably taken the job late in life because he needed to survive. There was dignity in that. There used to be respect for it, too. But now, it seemed, there was just disdain. When George approached and asked if he was okay, the man just nodded, barely meeting his eyes. "It's not the worst job I've had," he mumbled. "Just gotta get through the day." That phrase echoed in George's chest long after he stepped back outside. Just gotta get through the day. That wasn't the spirit they'd built this place on. That was survival, desperation, and it was everywhere. Over the next few days, George made visits to 2 more locations in the area. He wore different clothes, changed his walk slightly, never spoke unless spoken to. He didn't need to. The patterns repeated themselves like a broken song. Indifference at the register, filth in the restrooms, cold stares instead of greetings, and always at least one employee who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. At one store, a young woman was in tears near the dumpster out back, hiding behind a stack of cardboard. When he gently asked if she needed help, she shook her head and whispered, "It's just the way they talk to you here. You stop feeling like a person after a while." George sat in his rental car that night, staring at the logo on the to-go bag beside him. That logo used to mean something. It used to stand for second chances, for trust, for community. Now it looked like a lie. How had it gone this far without him seeing? The problem wasn't just a few bad employees. It was a chain of silence, a culture of corner-cutting and cruelty passed down like a virus. No one trained these kids to care. No one corrected them when they laughed at customers. No one stepped in when money went missing. Accountability had vanished from the top down, replaced by quotas, metrics, and a revolving door of low-paid workers too tired to fight for anything better. And then he remembered something else June had said, something he hadn't thought about in years. If your foundation's cracked, don't redecorate. Tear it down and rebuild. That night, George made a decision. He didn't just want to catch people in the act. He wanted proof. He wanted patterns. And more than that, he wanted to understand how deep the infection had spread. So he made some calls. Quietly, discreetly. No legal teams, no press releases. Just a pair of consultants from a firm that specialized in undercover workplace ethics assessments. He paid out of pocket, instructed them to plant observers across 5 locations, and asked for everything: recordings, notes, staff behavior breakdowns. He didn't want to go public. Not yet. He wanted the truth. Unedited. Because somewhere along the line, the company that had started with love and grit had become a machine. And now machines were running it. But machines couldn't feel, couldn't care, couldn't protect the things that mattered most. And George Whitaker had seen enough machines in his lifetime to know when it was time to shut one down. The decision wasn't made with anger, it was made with clarity. George had spent a lifetime solving problems in kitchens, but this was no broken oven or late shipment. This was systemic decay masquerading as business as usual, and he knew instinctively that it couldn't be confronted with a press release or a stern email from headquarters. So he planned the next phase like a general preparing for war, with precision, subtlety, and the element of surprise. The firm he'd contracted arrived under the guise of an anonymous third-party evaluation company performing quality assurance visits. Standard enough to avoid suspicion, but thorough enough to uncover rot beneath polished surfaces. They wore street clothes, posed as customers, and sometimes even posed as potential employees attending interviews. Their tools were simple: audio recorders, small hidden cameras, and notebooks filled with coded observations. Within 48 hours, George had raw footage from 3 different stores. He watched every second of it alone, in a hotel room with the curtains drawn, the glow of the laptop screen flickering against his drawn face. The first video opened with a customer struggling to read the digital kiosk, his glasses dangling from his shirt collar as he poked at the screen with confusion. A teenage employee behind the counter leaned over and whispered something to her coworker, then burst out laughing. "Bet he still uses a flip phone," she sneered. The man walked away, visibly embarrassed, and George paused the footage just to breathe. The second clip showed a delivery driver, visibly limping, being told to hurry the hell up by a shift leader who then slammed the door in his face when he asked for a signature. George watched, jaw clenched, as the man stood there silently before turning back toward his truck, head lowered. There was no pride in this service, no dignity, no respect, only control, mockery, and rot. But it was the third clip that broke something inside him. It was captured during the late evening rush, 2 teen employees joking loudly behind the counter, while a mother tried to juggle her toddler and an overflowing drink tray. As she struggled to balance the cups, one of the boys offered a hand, but just as she reached out, he pretended to slip and let one of the drinks fall, splattering over the floor and her shoes. "Oops," he said, smirking. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just wiped her shoe with a napkin while her child began to cry. The other employee turned away, shoulders shaking from laughter. Free entertainment, he muttered under his breath, not knowing his mic was still on. George closed the laptop. He didn't move for a full hour. He thought about the promises he made to June on their wedding day, about the time she used to coach new hires personally, making sure they understood the why behind every smile, about the time she sat with an angry customer for 30 minutes just to apologize for a misplaced sandwich, and ended up hiring his daughter a week later. Those values hadn't just been bullet points in a mission statement. They were sacred, and now they were gone, trampled, replaced by viral pranks and weaponized apathy. George poured himself a glass of water and looked in the mirror. He wasn't just the CEO. He was the one who'd stepped back. He was the one who let this infection spread unchecked. And now, he had to decide whether he was willing to dismantle what he had built just to find the heart again. The next day, the firm sent more footage. This time, it included a recorded conversation between two assistant managers talking in the walk-in freezer. One of them, in a hoodie and apron, casually mentioned he'd started shorting the register every Thursday because nobody checks Thursdays. The other one nodded and said, "I just say the new kid messed up the drawer. No one cares as long as the numbers add up by the weekend." It was said so casually, so comfortably, it sounded like they were discussing lunch. George turned off the audio. He didn't need to hear more. They were operating without consequence. And in the absence of consequence, cruelty flourished. He called the firm and asked them to prepare transcripts. He wanted everything documented, names, faces, time codes. But most importantly, he wanted testimonies from the silent ones, the employees who looked the other way or endured in silence. He needed to know who still had hope, who might still be worth saving. Later that night, he visited the first location again, alone. He sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before going in. This time, he didn't dress down. He wore a charcoal suit, crisp shirt, no tie, clean-shaven, sharp, regal. He didn't walk in like a customer. He walked in like the man who owned the building and every square foot within it. As he stepped inside, the boys at the counter straightened. One of them blinked in recognition, uncertain. The other just muttered, "Can I help you, sir?" George didn't answer. He looked around, at the tables, at the floor, at the manager peeking out from the back office, eyes wide. And then he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was cold, measured, the kind of smile that arrives before a storm. He didn't speak that day. Not yet. He just turned and left after a slow scan of the space, leaving behind a room thick with confusion and fear. The reckoning was coming, and they knew it. That night, he wrote down a list of every employee across the 5 locations he'd visited. He marked names. Green for the silent victims, red for the predators, yellow for those on the fence. And then he called his board. Not to warn them, not to debate, but to notify them. "There will be changes," he said. "And we're not doing this behind glass. I'm going to the stores myself, with cameras, with proof. And I'm going to ask every one of them one question. Do you still believe in what this place stands for? If the answer's no, they're gone." Silence on the other end. Then, a quiet voice from the oldest member of the board. "We've been waiting for you to say that." George hung up and looked at the growing file of footage and testimonies on his laptop. This wasn't just about cleaning house anymore. This was about reclaiming something sacred. And if that meant risking headlines, lawsuits, or public embarrassment, so be it. He would rather burn down the entire structure than leave behind something hollow wearing the skin of his legacy. Tomorrow, the storm would begin. It began not with sirens or announcements, but with a heavy silence that rolled in like fog on a forgotten morning. The restaurant opened at 11 a.m., and by 11:03, George Whitaker stood at the front counter, no disguise, no ambiguity, no pretense of being anything less than the man whose signature had once been stamped onto every founding charter in the Grillcraft system. He wore the same charcoal suit, his tie a deep burgundy that seemed to bleed with quiet intent, and behind him stood 2 members of the board, a pair of compliance officers, and one man holding a black leather portfolio thick with evidence. The employees behind the counter froze. The same boys who once joked about homeless job seekers and pocketed extra change now stood like statues behind the fryer and cash register, their smirks replaced by the hollow gaze of recognition. The room had gone cold. Customers in line fell silent. The manager emerged from the back, confused, then terrified, her face draining of color as George's eyes met hers and didn't waver. Without raising his voice, he began to speak. This store and 4 others in this region have been operating under observation for the past 8 days. What we've found is alarming, disheartening, and deeply inconsistent with the mission this company was founded on. He turned to the patrons watching from their seats. If you have been mistreated here, ignored, belittled, or mocked, on behalf of Grillcraft, I apologize. A murmur rippled through the space. One woman nodded solemnly. Another pulled out her phone to record. George didn't flinch. He gestured for the compliance officer beside him to open the folder. Printed photos, transcript excerpts, and stills from surveillance footage were passed to the staff one by one. The teenage boys didn't deny it. They didn't even try. Their heads hung low. The manager stammered, trying to shift blame onto district expectations and poor training. But George cut her off with a simple shake of his head. One by one, he recited moments from the footage. The mocking of a disabled man, the humiliation of a single mother, the refusal to train new hires with decency. Each time he spoke, he didn't use anger as his weapon. He used truth, delivered with such stillness it felt like thunder. This business was built on second chances, he said. But second chances are earned, not expected. He gave the boys a choice. You can walk out now, or you can sit down and explain to me exactly how this happened, and what you think it says about yourselves. They sat. Shame soaked every inch of their postures. One began to cry. The other, to his credit, spoke. His name was Tyler, 17, still in high school. He admitted he was never trained, just handed a headset and told to figure it out. He said the district manager only visited once a month, and when he raised concerns about the register being off, he was told, if it balances by the weekend, don't worry about it. That name, the district manager, kept coming up, not just in this store, but in the reports from the other locations too. A man named Rick Holloway, charismatic, polished, but with a toxic blend of indifference and intimidation that let bad behavior fester without scrutiny. George made a call on the spot. Holloway was terminated immediately. No severance. No negotiations. Just a quiet goodbye. The board member beside him handled the legalities, but George delivered the news himself. One simple sentence down the phone. You no longer work for us. Then he turned back to the staff and did something no one expected. He rehired 2 employees who had been unjustly let go. One was a single mother, Clara, fired for insubordination after she refused to let a coworker throw out unsold meals that could have been donated. The other was an older man named Lester, the one George had found rubbing his aching knee near the back room. When Clara walked back into the store, she didn't hold her head high out of pride. She held it steady like a survivor returning to a battlefield. Lester, too, was speechless, until George clapped a hand on his shoulder and said, I owe you an apology. The crowd inside the restaurant applauded. For the first time in weeks, the space felt human again. George moved through the building like a surgeon, cutting out the rot with precision, but leaving the good tissue intact. Not everyone was fired. Some were placed on probation, given one final chance to learn, improve, and commit to the company's core values. Others resigned quietly, unable to look him in the eye. But it wasn't over. The following week, George visited each of the other 4 locations personally. The board called it overkill. He called it repair. In one store, he found a shift leader who'd taken it upon herself to secretly keep a log of poor treatment and had tried, unsuccessfully, to send it to HR. George promoted her on the spot. In another, he found an employee who'd donated his own time to clean the dining room after hours, unpaid, because it felt wrong to leave it like that. George doubled his pay and asked him to help lead the new training program he would soon be launching. Everywhere he went, he reminded them of why Grillcraft had been created. Not to flip burgers, he said, but to flip narratives, to turn struggle into stability, to make fast food feel like a place where people matter. He changed the onboarding process overnight. He reinstated June's original training tapes and added a segment on dignity, ethics, and kindness. He created a hotline that went directly to his desk. Anonymous reports, no filters, no excuses. And for the two boys, Tyler and his friend Mason, George did something even more unexpected. He gave them a second chance. Under mentorship, under scrutiny, but also under guidance. If you really want to change, he said, then start by facing what you've done and teaching others why it's wrong. They agreed. They apologized on video, not scripted, not edited, just raw, honest confessions about how easy it is to become cruel when no one's watching. George made that video part of the new employee orientation, not to shame them, but to remind everyone what apathy looks like, and how close we all are to becoming it. In the weeks that followed, reviews went up. Customers noticed. Staff morale lifted. Turnover slowed. Something ancient and sacred began to pulse again beneath the corporate polish. A heart, steady and human. George didn't celebrate. He didn't throw a gala or issue a press release. He just kept visiting stores, talking to cashiers, listening. Rebuilding not the business, but the soul beneath it. Because a reckoning, if done right, doesn't end with punishment. It begins with responsibility. Weeks passed, and the wave of change George had set in motion began to ripple further than anyone had predicted. What started as a reckoning at 5 troubled stores soon evolved into a company-wide cultural audit. Headlines emerged, but George declined every interview. He didn't want to spin the story, he wanted to live the correction. He returned to headquarters, not with triumphant speeches, but with a handwritten report titled The Human Ledger, chronicling every moment from his undercover visits. It was raw, messy, honest. Inside were stories not just of misconduct but of resilience, of people like Clara, who stayed kind despite cruelty, and Lester, who showed up to work every day with a limp and a silent dignity that outshone every manager he'd served under. The boardroom was silent as he read excerpts aloud, voice breaking once as he quoted a delivery driver who'd said, "I don't expect respect anymore. I just try to get in and out without being humiliated." The company's rebranding campaign was halted. The shiny, sterile marketing efforts that had tried to modernize the Grillcraft identity were shelved. In their place came something deeper. George insisted on embedding the founding values into every part of the business. Training, hiring, leadership, customer service. Every store was required to undergo a moral audit, not just a financial one. A new initiative called the June Standard was created in honor of his late wife. An internal pledge that every franchise owner, manager, and team member would sign, promising to uphold compassion, respect, and accountability. George also launched a program called Second Chance Circles, where employees could anonymously report workplace toxicity and receive direct follow-up from a team independent of corporate influence. It wasn't about optics. It was about integrity, about finally standing in the gap between what they said they stood for and what was actually happening behind the counters. But beyond the corporate shifts, something more personal began to stir. One morning, George visited the very first Grillcraft location, now a company-owned memorial site with no active kitchen, preserved mostly for show. It was empty when he arrived. Dust coated the register. Faded photos lined the walls. In the corner of the dining room sat a small locked cabinet labeled Founder's Keepsakes. George hadn't opened it since June's passing. Slowly, hands trembling, he unlocked it and pulled out a worn envelope taped shut with their initials written across the front in her handwriting. He opened it, revealing a folded note and a Polaroid photo of the two of them behind the original grill, arms around each other, both covered in flour and grease, grinning like fools. The note was simple. "When you forget why, come home." His breath caught in his chest. The tears came quietly, soaking the paper until the ink blurred. In that moment, in the silence of that dusty space, George understood something profound. His legacy wasn't what he left behind. It was what he refused to walk away from. He didn't sell the business. He didn't retire. Instead, he made the radical decision to return to the floor, not just symbolically but physically. Every quarter, he would rotate through stores across the country, working as a line cook, a cashier, a trainer. No cameras, no media, just sleeves rolled up and grease on his palms. Word spread among the staff. Some thought it was a stunt. But when they saw him sweeping floors without being asked, staying late to help a struggling employee memorize the register system, they realized it was real. Slowly, the myth of the distant CEO was replaced with the truth of a man who cared too much to stay behind glass. At one location, a teenager named Emily, who had almost quit after being bullied by her old manager, told George, "I didn't think anyone up top even knew my name. Now I know you care if I stay." That was enough. That was everything. The boys, Tyler and Mason, kept their word. Under the mentorship program, they turned into advocates for the very standards they once mocked. Tyler helped develop an anti-harassment training module that would be implemented nationally. Mason worked closely with HR to improve new employee onboarding, making it more accessible and less intimidating. They weren't perfect, but they were sincere. And in the annual Grillcraft Summit, George brought them on stage. Not to shame them, but to show redemption in motion. "Mistakes are only permanent when we run from them," he told the crowd. "But when we face them, they become the foundation of something better." Applause erupted, not out of politeness, but out of respect. The industry took note. Competitors began adopting similar ethical oversight models. George didn't claim credit. He only smiled when asked and said, "We're just remembering who we are." By year's end, Grillcraft saw a 37% drop in employee turnover and a 21% rise in customer satisfaction. But those numbers, while satisfying, weren't what kept George going. It was the little things. A thank you card from an elderly customer who'd been greeted with kindness for the first time in years. A story from a franchise in Ohio about a teen employee who helped a blind customer navigate the soda machine. A letter from Clara, who was now managing her own store and had started a scholarship fund for single moms. Every small act was a thread, weaving a new future out of the frayed fabric of the past. The brand was still growing, but this time its roots were deeper. One night, long after closing time, George sat in his office, staring out the window at a lit-up billboard that now bore a new slogan: "Good food, great people, real purpose." It wasn't catchy in a marketing sense, but it was real, and it meant something. As he prepared to leave, he noticed a small box on his desk, a package with no return label. Inside was a laminated napkin, scribbled on with fading ink. It was the very napkin June had been writing on the first time they met. The poem was incomplete. The final line simply read, "A place to be seen." That was all she had written that night. And it was all he needed now. Because when all the profits fade and the market shifts and the analysts stop watching, what remains is who you were when no one was looking. And now, George Whitaker had made sure that every Grillcraft, no matter the state, the staff, the struggle, would always be a place to be seen.